So, thanks everyone for coming to VideoBrains again. Month after month, people keep coming, that's really nice.
Same thing.
So yeah, November's been exciting. We released new Call of Duty, new games. I decided to go a bit next-gen reboot with myself and grow some ridiculous facial hair and grow hair out of it. Anyway, so we're going to start with Rob talking about narrative starting points. First time I've seen the full talk title, so it's good I could read that. So yeah, you should all give it up for Rob, please.
Right, hello. Firstly, I've got to apologise for the font, because apparently when you port from a Mac, it turns it into the ugliest possible font. So, in a presentation about VR, just imagine that you can't use your eyes, and that this is just going to be a very ambient exercise in storytelling. Narrative starting points for virtual reality. Hello, my name is Robert Morgan, and I have ended up writing stories for games for all the major VR headsets. And I say all rather than both, because I actually, whether you do or not, I also include the Samsung Gear VR, which is the mobile which clips into a plastic headset which clips onto the front of your face. Now, however you feel about that, the reason I count it as one of the major headsets is that I would urge you to give it a go, because however you feel about the fact that it lacks rendering punch, if you give it a go, you might well find that it's made up for in other areas, which I'll go into in a bit. But basically, the practical upshot is the fact that it's not very heavy, the fact that it's not wired in and you can freely move, and you can keep it in a rucksack, has definite advantages both in terms of immersion and in terms of actual practicality. And immersion is what we're supposed to be talking about when it comes to these things, because, there we go, because no matter when this hardware was invented, or whether we're the current generation or the last time the virtual reality was supposed to work 20 years ago, there is a self-consciousness barrier to get over, and there's a practicality barrier to get over because you're clipping something to the front of your face. It's a new boundary, not just in terms of capabilities and software and all of these things, but it's also a new frontier in terms of what things humans are capable of swallowing in order to be entertained. Because these things have certain practical limitations, but of course, the argument is that it's all going to be worth it when you have that really immersive experience. Now, I'm a true believer in that as well. But I wanted to start thinking about what a narrative, what a virtual reality native story would look like. Because, of course, when it comes to getting over that kind of practicality gap and that gap in immersion between the first time you put the helmet on and when you're really into the story, graphics, 3D rendering, polygons, that's where most of the work is going to be done. But I wanted to think about what a story in virtual reality would do, what it would look like, what would happen when it was natively written for virtual reality rather than being a port of another title that just came over onto Oculus. Because when you're in virtual reality, it's kind of, from a game writing perspective, it's kind of pulling the player in a couple of interesting new directions, because you're seeing the world in a new and slightly odd sort of way. You're seeing it in a new way, but with some new limitations through new eyepieces. But also, you're kind of radically 3D embodied in that world in a new way, because you're so immediately there in a way that hasn't really been possible when you have a TV over there. When you are present in the world, well, when the world is being beamed through your eyeballs, it means that you are also embodied in that world in a new, completely new 3D style of way. But it's not really you, and there are some identification problems with that, not least when you look down and don't see the body that you expect, which of course is a problem that everybody who works in VR is currently wrestling with. So in terms of creating a nice immersive story that really works in VR, how is that going to work? Basically, I wanted to talk about a few things that I've picked up from the projects I've worked on so far, my experiences in working with VR, and how I've found some horrendous pitfalls that hopefully I can help you avoid, and hopefully towards best practices for telling a story in virtual reality. So I want to talk about three things. The formatting has gone completely wrong. Forget the formatting. Three things. Number one is quantity. Actual amount of storytelling that you're doing, the amount of talk that you're doing, the amount that you're talking to the player, the number of words, if you want to quantify it, the amount of time that you spend telling a story. Number two that I want to talk about is practicality. You have to have an appreciation of the actual position of your player, where they are sitting in the room, how they're going to feel, how the first 5 minutes are going to feel in particular. and what those practical considerations have in terms of impact, what impact they have on the story that you're going to tell. And the third thing I want to cover is responsiveness, in terms of creating a world that actually feels like it's being played and being played with, rather than playing out in front of the player and still kind of, oh, now it just happens to be a bit closer. How can we get that gaminess in when people are trying to feel like they're really there in this world we're creating? So quantity, how much storytelling is good storytelling when it comes to virtual reality? Well, apologies if anybody has a phobia. No, seriously, I worked on this game for 3 months and then it couldn't be played by some of my nearest and dearest because of phobias. So, fair enough, sharks are a nightmare. So this is from the announcement demo for the Morpheus, which I wrote the demo for. And typically what you do, particularly if you write a studio game, is you write loads and loads and loads and then cut it back when functionality changes, and also when you kind of get a sense of what you do need to say to the player and what things you can safely assume that the player will assume without you needing to tell them. And what we found with this demo, for the first time working with Morpheus, was even more than usual, you can just cut it back. You just don't need to talk to that player, to the player. They've got other things on their mind. They've got better things to talk about. You really don't need to narrate what's about to happen or what is happening. I mean, that's a good rule of thumb in game writing anyway, but it's even more the case in virtual reality because the world is coming in, it's just streaming in through their eyeballs all the time. So what we found here is what was originally a kind of a shark attack where something goes wrong with the winch, you're in a shark cage, you get stuck underwater, and then there's sort of the ominous music starts, and then we kind of introduce the idea of threat in story by having somebody on an earpiece say, I'm picking something up on the scanner. What we found in practice was that it actually worked a lot better and was a lot more interesting if the person who was talking to you talked a lot less, and also was kind of oblivious of what was happening to you. This is somebody who's up on the control boat. Maybe they have a scanner, maybe they don't. They might be aware that something's gone wrong, but it was way more interesting to leave the player dangling on their own down in the water with something horrendous happening to them, without the story in terms of dialogue trying to compensate or trying to tell you what was going on or trying to fill in the gaps. It was way more interesting to just really envelop the player in this world and then actually juxtapose it with a few things that someone was quite innocently whistling away on the other end of the line or saying, I'm sure we'll have this technical problem solved any minute. Meanwhile, the shark is beating its head against the cage. It's an example, and it's an example I keep going back to in my head of where not only less is more, but less lets you do things differently. And I think that's absolutely crucial with VR. You can boil this down to a simple rule, and I've done that in the past. Does everybody know what this means? Yeah, okay. Never assume. But I'm reluctant to use this rule that, shorter is always better. I don't think it's quite that simple. Actually, I think it's a bit more like the principle in level design, where if you have a dense, corridor, action-heavy sequence, then you should probably follow it up with a wider, more contemplative, more peaceful sequence where you get to breathe in a little bit. And obviously, the past masters of this are Naughty Dog in terms of their level design, because you'll have a horribly close, really tense section, and then you'll kind of break out into some sunlight. Now, whatever you think about that, again, it's just an example from level design. I think the same thing takes place in story, because you need to deliver bits and pieces of story, but you always need to make sure that you don't outstay your welcome. Storytelling is kind of a finite resource in terms of how much time you can spend nattering away in the player's ear. It's a resource that kind of it rebuilds itself over time. So I was trying to think of a suitable, memorable analogy for a limited resource which replenishes itself over time, which is why I called it that. It's a good rule of thumb, I think. Make sure you don't outstay your welcome, and think of the amount of time you spend talking to your players as something that you can kind of lean in a bit and then give them some space and then just, anyway. Number 2, oh God, what's happened to this? Practicality, fittingly. So, the player has volunteered to clip this huge thing to their face in order to have a really intense experience of this game. This is fantastic, but it also means there are a number of barriers that we have to help them over before they can have the full experience of the game. So the rule of thumb that I'm calling this is get past the space helmet, get past this big sci-fi thing, help them to forget that they're wearing it, because no matter how hyped up you are about VR and how ready you are to be an early adopter, there is still those first 5 minutes where instead of paying attention to the game, you are very likely to be adjusting the headband. So how can the story help out with getting past this practicality barrier? It's almost as if players in VR are being pulled in two different directions. They're being pulled towards immersion. There's all sorts of things literally pulling them away and distracting them. Typically in games, in order to try to guarantee immersion, you may not be able to see because they've resized. So this is from Alien Isolation. It's an alien, and that's presumably somebody's bedroom port of Team Fortress. Just as an example, typically in order to guarantee immersion, games throw action at you in order to keep you immersed by never giving you a chance to stop, never giving you a chance to think about it. Now that's fine for that sort of game, but particularly when it comes to game stories, it can't work like that because stories don't work like that, because stories can't just continually shove things at you. They need to step back, they have quiet moments, structurally speaking. Whatever kind of story it is, there are ups and downs in terms of storytelling. So you can't guarantee immersion by just snapping the headset on and then just beaming in like MTV style swift cuts constantly. So in terms of storytelling, you have a couple of options really. You could try to incorporate reality into your game's conceit. What I mean by that is you can take the practical limitations or the practical distractions of playing one of these games and then actually fit it into your game in a way that fits in with the conceit. So this is an example of a game where you might have your hands bound in front of you in order to provide a kind of muscle memory explanation for why the player in reality is actually sitting with a controller in front of them. So that when they imagine looking down at their hands, in game, they're seeing their hands in front of them and they have a reason for the fact that their hands are kind of together, because their hands are bound together. I mean, you could just as easily do a game where somebody is sitting there holding a controller. It's just that the vast majority of us play lots of games for escapist reasons, and we probably don't necessarily want to replicate that experience in our games. There's nothing stopping it from happening, of course, because you could hold a more badass joystick, but the further you get from the thing that you're actually holding in your hands, the less it's going to be an interesting immersive quirk, and the more it's going to be a gimmick. This is in danger of falling into gimmick territory, but it's an interesting one. Perhaps more useful, similarly, you're wearing a headset, you can actually be a character wearing a headset. But kind of more usefully, I think, in terms of something that doesn't dictate large mechanics in your game, and just something to think about if you're writing a VR story. What I've found is the most useful thing is to think about the call to adventure, which is, as in a film, as in any game, the experience, usually in the first 5 minutes or so, where you introduce the player to the world, but also you give them their reason for participating in the adventure, which, in a typical classic game is usually, they've killed your brother or something. Whatever it is, it's the point at which you explain to the player, in story terms, why they want to be involved, why they should care, why they don't just go home. Now, when I think about call to adventure, I often think about Broken Age. This is one of the two main characters from Broken Age. This is just an example of two different useful things that I think about in terms of call to adventure, in terms of VR. So it doesn't matter if you haven't played Broken Age, what happens to this character is that at the start of the game, he lives a very lonely life, but he has simulated adventure provided for him all the time. He has a kind of AI parent who provides adventures for him, but he's not satisfied with them because they're not real. It's a really classic call to adventure because his life is a certain way and he's dissatisfied with it, and that's kind of what sparks off the rest of the story. He kicks off against the way the world currently is, and he generates conflict, and that's how the story moves on. I'm not saying necessarily that you need to go off and read a bunch of screenwriting books, which was certainly a trend in talks about games 5 years ago. That was a useful process to go through. What I'm talking about very specifically is the fact that there's some inspiration to be taken here. It's a classic call to adventure, but it's also really interesting that simulated adventure is not strong enough for this guy. He wants something a bit more real. And there might be something we can take from that for a call to adventure for a VR experience. Imagine if in your VR experience, experience, the first 5 minutes are inside a kind of miniaturized version of the world, or a limited version of the world, even a virtual reality tutorial. Because the practical limitations of the helmet means that people are going to spend the first 5 minutes getting used to it and warming up and adjusting the headband. If you give them a chance to adjust and warm up to it and fiddle around with the headband while they're in a kind of a sub-world, whether it's they start the game in the back of a dark van being driven somewhere, or they start the game in a packing crate, or they start the game in a cheesy tutorial sequence, then, once that 5 minutes is cut off, you're ready to introduce the full world to them at the point when they've properly warmed up, and when they're ready to be called to adventure, without the best excuse for not participating in the adventure being, yeah, but this thing is really uncomfortable. They will have got used to the headset, and you've taken them through a kind of a virtualization experience, and then opened up the van doors and taken them out into the real world. You get 2 bites at the cherry of that wow moment, which is what everybody talks about in terms of creating a VR experience. You get the initial wow moment, when they've got lots of other things on their mind, and then once you've warmed your player up, you can open them up into the full world and give them a second really big wow experience. Number 3 is responsiveness. So I tend to talk about responsiveness a lot. What does this mean in terms of VR? This is about making a game which actually responds to the way it is played, specifically in dialogue, because that's what I happen to do, but I think this applies to all sorts of factors, particularly because the way I tend to think about this is check your corners. This is my way of remembering that when it comes to 3D, edge cases are even more complicated than normal edge cases are. So check your corners means it's an edge case that's in 3D, because when you have your character embodied in a 3D world in a completely new way, all of the edge cases in terms of what they can do to push the rules of the world and find out where the edges are and find out where the limitation of the design is, those are exacerbated because the player feels like they ought to be able to explore this environment freely, whatever it is, whether it's a bird simulator or whether they're talking to an NPC. And I take talking to an NPC as an example because it's probably where this happens most starkly. Because the thing that everybody talks about is the uncanny valley in terms of VR, and that is definitely a barrier that we have to get past, or a trough that we have to get out of. The uncanny valley where a character that you experience in a 3D format, if they don't look human enough, then you have a weirded out experience when you're talking to them. There's also a dialogue and storytelling element to it, because no matter how realistic they look, and however much graphical power is spent on generating that character, they're also going to fail the uncanny valley test if they don't behave like humans. Now, it's going to take an enormous amount of programming and AI and dialogue writing in order to get past that hump. But for kind of the current generation of VR games, I think the best way to think about it is in terms of edge cases. So my example is a social edge case. So it's very unusual in a social situation to actually start really breaking the rules really bad. I do apologize, I'm sorry. That is the first thing that everybody does in 3D, in virtual reality. They put the helmet on, if you put a character in front of them, they're going to get up in their grill. Every single time, because it's almost as if when you put that headset on, our players are becoming infants. They are being introduced into a completely new environment in which they're babies because they don't know the rules of social interaction. And the only way to teach them the rules of social interaction, basically, is to have somebody call them on it, is to say something. So what I mean by an edge case in dialogue could be, for example, if you really get up there and start looking down straight into her eyes, she has to say something about it, or at least move away. Because otherwise, your infant 3D virtual reality player who's trying to learn the social rules of being in this environment, they'll never learn those rules. They'll never learn how to be comfortable in it. So yes, it will probably get really tiresome if we constantly have NPCs talking about personal space. I think in the first wave of virtual reality games, that will probably be the new arrow to the knee, because you're constantly going to be barging into people because you don't think of them as people. But they have to react, because otherwise you will never learn to think of them as people, and the immersion barrier will never be climbed. So dialogue edge cases to me means if this person is a mission vendor and they've done their talk, they've said their piece, they've given you, oh, your sister's dead or you need to do your homework, or you need to, whatever it is. If you then stand and stare silently at them for a minute, you need to have thought of something for them to say or something for them to do. There's going to be hundreds and hundreds of options in terms of, what is the edge case here? What could the player do that would break the rules? I'm not saying you need to compensate for every possibility, because the player could stand and stare at them, they could go and be fascinated by this bookshelf, which if you look closely actually has a load of Harry Potter books. And try and read the spines. They could turn their back on that character and they try and back it up into them. There's hundreds and hundreds of permutations, and I'm not saying you need to compensate for all of them, but I think you need to think of a few key edge cases and then say something in dialogue, or at least have a character behavior to compensate for them. Because otherwise, you're never going to learn to think of them as somebody who has rules surrounding them, as a social entity. Because otherwise, you can make them as realistic as you want, and they're not going to seem like people, because they're just going to stand there. I mean, if in doubt, just have them leave the room. Because an NPC in motion is going to be far less uncanny than a static NPC, for whatever reason that they're static for. So, when it comes to dialogue, practically speaking, in code terms, it's no more complicated than doing a trophy. If you were going to give them a trophy for turning around and trying to back it up on the NPC, it's just as easy to have them play a piece of dialogue that says, please don't do that, that's quite weird. What you'll find is that it's really beneficial, because players will then learn, well, when I tried to break that rule, I learned that there are social or emotional consequences for doing that. And then they'll probably not spend quite so much of their time trying to break the rest of the game, even though you haven't thought of everything. If you think of a few key things, particularly the things that VR players always bloody do, which is attempt Eskimo kiss with nearest person, then you'll find that players start to think about the story a lot more and start to think about their immediate environment a lot less. Greater immersion leads to greater expectations. As soon as we started giving players this really immersive experience, their expectations are not going to match it. We all know this, because hype is the most dangerous thing. It's one of the most dangerous things in any creative industry. The minute that you start making promises about immersion, you have to follow them up with storytelling as well as with graphics, because otherwise people aren't going to understand why these characters aren't responding the way they look like they should respond. So in story terms, the way I think of it is they can have the best written speech that you want in terms of delivering their mission. But you need to think of the edge case of what happens, not only if the player decides to go ahead and stab them, but what if the player listens to their whole speech while standing at a 90-degree angle to them? You can't just have them go and then deliver their speech like this. But a few simple solutions, a few simple bits of dialogue, come and stand here when I'm talking to you, will probably help the player over that hump, at least for now. So just very quickly, as a side point, when it comes to voice-led story, because the first wave of VR will get over this problem by not having very many NPCs that you can actually talk to, and instead we'll have them off in another room, or we'll be talking to you over a tannoy, or we'll be talking to you through a radio. Just very quickly, because I've done those scripts before, what I've kind of learned from working on those sorts of scripts is three things about having a voice-led story which will immediately raise the quality of it. There we go. Number one, if you're going to be talking to the player entirely through an earpiece and you're not going to have an NPC in the room talking to them, number one, definitely get a good tannoy VO reference, because people talking on walkie-talkies talk very differently than they do when talking to a person. It's easy to say, but it's easier to see, and you should have a look at somebody talking through a walkie-talkie, because the rules of talking when you can't see somebody and you don't know whether they're talking or not are very different. So if you're writing a script, or if you're trying to teach an actor how to talk like this, then use a reference. This is actually casting, like a first casting video for the character of Ripley from Aliens, and Sigourney Weaver does an absolutely amazing talking to somebody through a walkie-talkie, even though the person she's talking to is actually in her eye line. It's an amazing physical performance, and it's a good reminder of what it's actually like to talk to somebody. If you play the old Metal Gear Solid, the reason they don't have it as a voiceover while you're running around the levels, and instead they bring up the codec so there's a face, you can see the person you're talking to, because they have to deliver a lot of really complicated story and need something to focus on. But you can't really do that in VR, because you don't want to just have a picture of somebody the whole time. If you're going to be talking to them through an earpiece while they go on with their lives, A, make sure it sounds like people actually sound when they're talking through an earpiece. B, get to the point. If you want to deliver an objective, say it, make a joke, do a little bit of additional story, and then say the objective again, and then get out of the way between the player and the game world. And lastly, think long and hard. Do you want a silent protagonist? Silent protagonists have definite benefits, but there's also some costs as well, particularly because silent protagonists are really hard to get right. If you want to get an example of a good one, obviously Half-Life, but also surprisingly Crysis 2. It does a silent protagonist quite well in terms of the way players talk to the protagonist without really highlighting or making you realise that you never say anything in return. If you do want a silent protagonist, those are good examples. If you don't want a silent protagonist, also fantastic, but I would urge you not to fall into the trap of thinking that in order to kind of embody or impress yourself or etch yourself onto this character, or to identify with them, you therefore have to have a really boring character. There's a lot of games fall into that trap of thinking, well, we have to have the player kind of feeling like they can be fully immersed in this character, so they can't have too many characteristics. I think that leads to a situation where you, the person you're supposed to be, are the least interesting person in the game, and that makes it really hard to sympathise with you. That's a trap that lots of games fall into. The Far Cry games fall into that trap. They're wonderfully characterised with everybody we talk to, but you end up being not that interesting. And you don't need to be pretending to be this character, remember. You need to sympathise with them. So that whole making them a cipher in order to make it more easy to get into this character's head, I think is a bit of a red herring. So that's the end. In terms of the quantity of talking to your players, remember, it's a renewable resource, but you've got to let it renew. In terms of practicality, don't pretend that they're not wearing a helmet. Help them get past the helmet and get into your world instead. And in terms of responsiveness, think of your edge cases as huge blossoming areas of possibility, but think of a few key things that you can do to acknowledge the fact that your player has tested the boundaries of your virtual world and respond to it in a way that's appropriate according to your story. That's where I'm going to leave it. Thank you very much. I'd also really like to hear from anybody if you've played any VR games recently, if you have experience with putting the headset on. What was your experience? What other kind of rules of thumb have you come up with? Do you disagree strongly with any of this? Please let me know. How much time have we got for questions, Jake?
Couple of questions?
Couple of questions. 2 questions. Anybody? Hello.
Yeah, not really a question, but I played the Shark demo with the thing at the. What is it? Unity? No, not Unity. Somewhere anyway. But yeah, with Morpheus thing, yeah, that was really cool. I spent a while being confused as to where to look, only because I realised I could look behind me, so then spent kind of half the demo spinning around.
Yes, there is kind of a.
In that demo, it's not like massively important because you can see when the shark comes, but I guess as part of the sort of guiding the player where to go and what to look at,
yeah.
I suppose you've got to bear in mind the fact that they're probably going to spend a while going, oh awesome, I can see over there.
Yeah, absolutely.
And that's not necessarily where your game is.
Hence, you need to get out of the way from between you and them, basically. I should say that that demo has since been iterated on, so you may have played the version I worked on, but you might have played
new Shark.
But yeah, there is also, certain VR demos also have that kind of the Exorcist effect, where you realise that your head can go all the way around. And it's worse than not being able to do that because it's a really odd sensation. Yes?
And a lot of things you mentioned are things about the awe and wonder of VR in the first 5 minutes.
Yeah.
And like how to overcome that. How long do you think it'll be a problem for? Like 5 years from now, do you think maybe we won't have to worry about these things and we'll have different kinds of rules of thumb? Or
Sort of, but it's going to be dictated by market forces and also by adoption. Some people will be very blasé about putting the helmet on, and some people will never have tried it. So there'll be lots of people who kind of need that my first VR experience. I do think that, if you watch YouTube videos of people who are very experienced with their headsets, they tend to get right into the game. But also, most VR demos that you see also tend to get right into the game. They tend to, for example, be a port of a fairly normal shooter that has a really big bombastic opening. And I would generally say don't spend your resources on that. Give them a bit of warm-up time, and then when they're ready to kind of really absorb it, have your big moment. In terms of how long it'll be relevant for, I don't know. I think we are at a new frontier. We're going to have to figure it out as we go along. Any other very, very quick questions? Yes.
I was just wondering where you stand on sitting in terms of getting past the helmet. I've had quite a few experiences with the Oculus, and my best experiences have been flight sims because I am in the posture of the character.
Yes.
That,
You understand why you're sitting.
Yeah, exactly.
I think that's a strong argument for it, and I think, again, greater immersion leads to greater expectations. As soon as you start giving people that in to let them believe a little bit more in what they're seeing and in the world, they're going to find the areas that they can't believe in. So all of these new practical problems that are being presented by the advent of VR, are gamers now going to need a new chair for every game? Or is every game going to need to explain why you're sitting down? It's no surprise that these are coming up, because this is a kind of, it's as big a problem as the original problems of introducing screens into people's houses. Their living rooms will have to get slightly bigger and longer so that they're not causing their eyes to bleed. These practical problems will have to be overcome gradually. For me, I would generally go for sitting down, because nothing is worse than a commercial product coming out and a week later there being a raft of lawsuits of people who bang their heads on the skirt. So, to be honest, I think we'll probably see legal warnings telling people to sit down on a lot of games anyway. So people will have to deal with it. Plus, I play games for recreation. So, although I'll kind of gear myself up to play a particular boss and I'll want to be energetic for it, most of the time I don't want to stand in my living room. I want to sit down. Right, I better call it. Thank you very much.